Hello everyone, this is Piyush. Today we are here to discuss a very important question. Undoubtedly, this is precisely about one optional paper, that is the history optional paper. History optional. But then I guess it is not precisely about an optional paper. Rather, it does have a more intense meaning. The moment it comes to your UPSC journey, there's something which plays very important role, and that is the optional paper. And why it does play very important role? Because undoubtedly it is either helping you to clear this UPSC examination, or else it becomes a sort of hurdle for you to clear this exam. And that's why when it comes to selecting this optional paper, that always remains a dilemma among the students, that what optional paper they should go for. But then when it comes to this question, I think there are certain things you should be very clear of, that when you have been choosing any subject or any optional paper, like this decision is not emotional, right? Or this should not be emotional. Rather, I think you should think in a very practical manner that which optional paper you should go for. Look, there's a very simple thing, whenever it comes to the optional paper, you have to understand ki ultimately what is the expectation that you are having from the optional paper. Nobody is here to become the master of that subject, because if anybody is damn interested in that subject, in that case probably they should go for pursuing their career in the PhD or MPhil or so on. But then here the objective is very clear, that you just want to you are expecting a good marks. Now the definition of good marks may be subjective. Maybe I can say that somewhere closer to 300 is basically one target which everybody is hoping, or everybody is expecting to score somewhere near to 300. Because if somebody is reaching 300, or if somebody is crossing 300, that's good enough, right? But even though if you are not able to cross 300, but if you are able to reach somehow closer to 300, it means ki the kind of expectation that you had from the optional, that's being fulfilled. So that's why I can say ki when it comes to selecting the optional paper, there's a very simple agenda, that somehow you have to go for go for such an optional paper that can fetch you marks, that can get you this much mark, that you are ultimately clearing this examination. But then, as I did tell you, that it is somehow a very strategic question, right? You can't take it in this way, it is okay, fine, I'll just go for any optional paper and I'll select XYZ and I'll just clear it. I think here you need to be very you need to be very strategic. Why? Because if you're not very strategic, in that case, the way there are several students, they have been facing problems, for 2 years they have taken one optional paper, and then after 2 years they are realizing that they have selected a wrong optional paper, and now this is the time to change it. But then somehow I'm not able to understand if you have selected one optional paper, you have read that optional paper for 2 years, you have prepared everything, you have written you have done the foundation course, you have gone for the answer writing, and after 2 years if you have been realizing that this optional paper is not meant for you and it is not giving you the proper outcome, in that case you should change this paper. And you have been changing another paper, and then again you have been starting the same process. Throughout my journey, I have come across several such students, those who have changed their optional paper twice. And now undoubtedly there are certain such examples where you can find that some people got selected also after changing their optional paper. On the other hand, you can find that there are certain students, and in fact the majority of such students, you can find that they have changed their optional paper, but undoubtedly they unfortunately they could not clear this exam. So that's why it remains a very tricky question. Probably this is the reason, because of what I have been telling you, that it is a question which is it is a question which is more related to what? It is more related to the strategy, that you have to make it since beginning, or let's say in the beginning, that whatsoever optional paper you have been choosing, you should be very confirmed of, right? Yes, this is the optional I want to go for, and in fact I am going to clear this exam with the help of this optional paper. But then, as I did tell you, that when it comes to selecting the optional paper, sometimes this decision becomes either emotional, I'll say. Emotional in what sense? Because people are having sometimes few emotions towards a subject. And then since they are so much sentimental about that subject, and that's where they want to go for. And the second thing, that is again very important, apart from being emotional, there is another thing which is somehow motivates them to select any particular optional paper, is the trend. Now what is the trend? Like in market, there are so much rumors about the optional paper. Rumors as in, like if you are taking this optional paper, undoubtedly you are going to be selected. If you are taking this optional paper, you have been like, somehow reducing your chances to be selected. Now these kind of rumors are there in the market. But I think this question is not very tricky as such. I think it can be resolved very easily. So first of all, we are just going to discuss about like, what strategy, or let's say what parameters you should keep in mind while selecting, what parameters, right, you should keep in mind while selecting the optional paper, because now this is very important. As I am telling you that if you have gone for a wrong decision, in that case in that case you are going to suffer, and in fact nobody is going to pay for it. It's ultimately you who is going to pay for it, right? And that's why be very strategic when it comes to selection of the optional paper. Now as I told you that what may be the criteria on what the optional paper should be selected. Now normally the criteria which are being followed, it's basically, I'll say that there were three important criteria that which are mostly being followed by the students. That first of all the criteria is this, that the optional you select, this is ultimately mark fetching. Okay, matlab you have to have this confidence, yes, what optional paper I have been taking, ultimately it is going to give you marks. The second thing, the second criteria which is mostly being followed by the students, that the syllabus should be small. Now if it is very small, in that case it is easy for you. Why? Because you are getting selected with this optional paper without putting great amount of hard work as such. So that's the second thing which is very important. And then finally it comes to third thing, that how come this particular optional paper is helping you in general studies, correct? Now I'll say here you're not supposed to be very emotional, correct? Emotional, again I'll say, why am I using this word emotional again and again? Because sometimes you believe ki okay, political science, or let's say sociology, or let's say anthropology, or let's say whatsoever subject is there, that is performing very good, and that's why I should go for this paper. I think that is not the right strategy of selecting the paper. Sometimes there are so much rumor about the things in the in the market, such as when it comes to mark fetching, that this perception that this optional paper is mark fetching and the second optional paper or the other optional papers are not mark fetching, this is basically a sort of, what to say, it's a sort of hegemony which had been created. It's a sort of rumor that has been created, okay, one optional paper is giving marks and one optional paper is not giving you the marks, right? And there is a very simple way of understanding this. Can you tell me about one optional paper, if anybody, Tom, Dick and Harry is selecting that optional paper and without doing the hard effort, ultimately that person is crossing 300? Or else it can be taken into different way also. If you believe that if I have taken an optional paper, I have done the substantial amount of hard work, in that case there are 100% chances that I am going to cross 300. It is never going to happen, right? In every subject you will find that there were only few students who are managing to cross a particular mark. So let's say, as I did tell you, that 300 is considered to be a sort of decent score. So if you believe in a particular subject, right, if majority of the people are crossing 300, on the other hand there is another subject where people are not able to clear 300, मतलब आप जो भी कर लीजिए, आप जितना भी कुछ कर लीजिए, ठीक है, आप बहुत सारी किताबें पढ़ लीजिए, आप 2-3 बार फाउंडेशंस कर लीजिए, आप अलग अलग जगह पे फाउंडेशन कर लीजिए, लेकिन इसके बाद भी अगर वो 300 क्रॉस नहीं हो रहा है, कोई भी क्रॉस नहीं कर पा रहा, in that case I think if cases like this, in that case I think the choice is very clear. But then you all know that actually this is not the reality. What happens in the reality, ultimately you'll find that in every paper there are certain people, they are managing to cross 300, or they are able to get somehow very good score. Because as per me, what is a sort of good score? If anybody, as I told you, is reaching closer to 300, if somebody is scoring let's say 280, in fact why to say 280, if somebody is crossing 270, 280, that's considered to be a very decent mark. And what is my definition of decent mark? Whether you are out of the final list because of the marks that you have scored in the optional paper or not. If you literally feel that you are out of the rank, out of the final list, just for this reason that you could not score very good in the optional, it means that the optional was responsible for it. But then, as I told you, that if anybody is crossing 270, I think that is in that case I can say ki just because of the optional you are not out. Maybe your performance was poor in some other areas because of what you are out. I have come across several such students that just by scoring 250 plus, they have managed to get into the final list. On the other hand, I have also come across several such candidates, those who have scored 270 plus, even though they could not manage to get into the final list. It means ki you should not expect that 320, 330, and sometimes some students do come and they ask they always used to say कि sir मुझे किसी भी तरीके से 320 क्रॉस करना है या 325 क्रॉस करना है. I think it is not something which is depending solely on you, right? It is depending on various other factors, and that's how this is one of the pragmatic approach ki yes, you should have you have to somehow prepare the optional paper in such a way that you are clearing that decent mark or you are going beyond that decent mark. So when it comes to this first criteria, as I did tell you that if you have this belief ki okay, if I have taken this optional paper, in that case there is 100% surety that you are going to cross 300, or let's say you are reaching close to 300, in that case I think choice is very clear. Then you should not think for the other options, rather you should go for that. But I believe that this is not the case. In every optional paper, both the cases are present. At one hand, people are not even able to manage 200. On the other hand, there are some people, they are managing to cross 300. So both the cases are there. It means it is a very subjective sort of thing, and that you need to keep in mind. Correct? The second important thing is the syllabus. Correct? Now, I think when it comes to the syllabus, right, there are certain optional papers, they are very popular in the market, UPSC market, I must say, because they are believed to be very short. And it was sometimes this kind of perception is there in the market that if you read this optional paper for 2 and 2.5 months, you'll be able to finish the subject. Practically speaking, I have never come across any such subject which can be covered just within 3 months. I'm not even why to say 3 months. Let me say very categorically 4 months. As you all know that there are certain very popular subjects these days, but even if we'll talk about these popular subjects, I must say that they are also taking more than 6 months. I have also come across that there are certain optional papers that are being finished in 9 months, 10 months, 11 months also. But then these subjects are very popular. Undoubtedly they are very popular, though they are being stretched for a longer period of time. The syllabus, the coverage of the syllabus does take time, and that's how it is being finished, but then they are somehow giving good result. So I think the small syllabus is something which is a sort of rumor. No optional paper is having very crisp syllabus, and in fact the other optional paper is having a sort of very wide syllabus, and it's a very practical sort of thing. Just think of this particular idea carefully, that why would UPSC makes the syllabus of any optional paper as very crisp? On the other hand, why would UPSC make any syllabus of any optional paper as very extensive, wide, and so on, right? Ultimately, UPSC is going to treat every subject equally. That is so quite fair, right? And if anybody is having doubt in that case, it is a sort of misconception. So basically, I must tell you, yes, the difference in the length of the syllabus is a possibility, but that difference I don't believe is more than of 1 month. Maybe one subject is consuming 1.5 months more. On the other hand, there were certain subjects that can be finished slightly earlier, but then this difference may be fixed somewhere between 4 months to 6 months. One optional paper that can be finished in 4 months. On the other hand, the next optional paper can be finished in 6 months. So I think that's how you can differentiate between the two. There is no subject as such which is very small. Then third, it comes to GS, right? That's a very important idea, and in fact you should be very careful for this. Why am I saying that you should be very careful for this? Because I have gone through, or I have come across such kind of ideas or the rumors among the students and the aspirants, that if you have taken this optional paper, in that case majority of the GS can be done. In fact, there are certain such rumors also. I have seen that if you cover let's say XYZ subject optional paper, in that case 50% of the syllabus of GS, right, that can be called as 500 marks, that can be covered from one optional paper only. Now I think again it is very hard to believe, right? Now it is quite possible that there are certain interlinkages, right, that cannot be refused. In fact, whatsoever optional paper you take, specifically the optional paper of humanities, I am not talking about the sciences, So every optional paper does having some sort of overlapping with the general studies, and it's quite natural also that that some sort of overlapping is there, because ultimately what are the optional papers? They are ultimately taken from some of the subjects only, some of the some of the general themes only. So let's say when it comes to polity and constitution, so from there PSR is evolved. When it comes to governance, public administration is evolving from there. When it comes to, let's say, geography, again geography as an optional paper is evolving there. So ultimately some sort of overlapping is quite natural. But then whether it is literally covering the 50% of the general studies syllabus, in that case I think the journey is very simple. So why to go for the other preparation? Let's say do it in this way, since while reading the optional you have been somehow gathering a sort of specialization in that subject. So it's very in that case the choice is very easy. You just go for that optional paper. आप उस ऑप्शनल पेपर को अच्छे से कवर कर लीजिए, आपके 500 मार्क्स जो है अब बहुत अच्छे से हो जाएगा, ठीक है. एंड आउट ऑफ दीज 500 यू कैन स्कोर 360% मार्क्स, द वे इट्स हैपनिंग इन द ऑप्शनल. इन द ऑप्शनल देयर आर हाई चांसेस दैट यू आर गेटिंग समहाउ क्लोजर टू 60% मार्क्स. सो लेट अस ट्राई टू सी इन दिस वे दैट यू प्रिपेयर दैट ऑप्शनल पेपर इन सच ए वे दैट आउट ऑफ दीज 500 you are scoring somewhere around 300 from that paper only, and from rest of the 500 marks, right? From rest of the 500 marks, let's say if you are able to score only 150 marks, I am not exaggerating, अब बहुत कम marks आप score करते हैं, let's say सिर्फ 150, even though that 300 plus 150 that becomes 450, and if you have been scoring 450 in any optional in general studies, I think that's fair enough. I think nothing else you need. So in that case you can actually ignore all the other areas, and just by going through a sort of going through a basic study of rest of the papers you can do it. But then you all know it is never happening, as I did tell you that some sort of overlapping or some sort of overlapping or the similarity in the syllabus that can be definitely noticed. But then here you should be very particular of one thing, that actually the way you have been dealing with the same concept in general studies, it is not the same approach what you are having in the optional paper. Maybe that subject or that topic seems very similar, right? It seems very equivalent, or let's say very similar, but that does not mean that the same approach is being followed. When you have been reading a particular thing in general study, or let's say particular theme in general study, and then when you read it in the optional paper, let me tell you categorically the things are way apart. They are very different, right? So don't have this misconception that this is how you are going to cover the general studies syllabus, because that's not applicable. As I did tell you that every subject is having some sort of overlapping with the general studies, and it is true for every subject, and the same is true for even history also. Let's say when it comes to history, and if you try to understand the sort of overlapping between history optional and GS, yes, you can find that there is a greater impact of this, and in fact that we can understand with respect to papers also, right? Let's say when it comes to history, so when you talk about paper 1, in paper 1 what is happening, as you all know, if you'll see the pattern of the last exam only, that happened recently, so you'll find that there were questions of 90 marks directly from history. 90 marks, they were directly from history, correct? But then apart from these 90 marks, I can tell you that there are 100 marks questions were there from from which part? From the social issues, right? Social issues. Now, when it comes to social issues, I must tell you that without having a good understanding of history, you won't be able to deal with the deal with the questions of social issues, because ultimately, when it comes to the social issues, without understanding the history, neither you would be able to understand them, first thing. And in fact, without referring the historical context, you won't be able to write the answers of those questions also. So I won't say directly, but indirectly in the paper 1 only, it covers around 190 marks. But again, I'm not saying just by covering history you can do it. Undoubtedly not, right? Undoubtedly not, because just by covering history you can't attempt all the questions, because you need to club your historical information with some current inputs, and that's how you're going to score very good in paper in the social issues question. In the similar fashion, when it comes to paper 2, even in paper 2 also you can find that there are certain issues, or there are certain aspects which are very similar. Let's say when it comes to Indian Constitution. Now you do not read exactly the Indian constitution, or you do not read the Indian constitution with a very different perspective, but then it is also pretty sure that you can't read the Indian constitution without having the historical perspective. That's number one. And without having the developments which were happening in the post independence era. So basically you see, or you read, or you study the historical development of the constitution. That's one. And then you even further see the developments in the constitution in the post independence era. So that's how I can say this is a very important thing. In the similar way, we can talk about, let's say, civil services. That's part of paper 2, which is related to governance. And then most importantly, we can't skip the issues related to IR. So as when it comes to IR, can anybody make you understand IR without having a good knowledge of the world history? So by the time you do not understand the world history, and then I'll say the relationship of the various countries of the world with India, I think that part cannot be dealt properly. So that's how we can say in paper 2 also some sort of impact can be noticed. In fact, the paper 3rd, which seems to be very different, right? The paper 3rd which seems to be very different, but even in paper 3rd also you can find certain sort of overlapping. Specifically when it comes to, let's say, the part which we study in the name of post independence, now you can find that it is having so much having so much relationship with paper 3, such as I'll be just referring few of the topics. Such as there is a topic which is there on land reform, correct? Now this land reform is a topic which is very important, and in fact the questions are being asked even in the general studies part and optional as well. Or else, let's say when it comes to another topic, let's say when it comes to development and the spread of extremism is concerned, extremism is concerned. So now this is another topic that you can understand with respect to history. So in the similar fashion, when it comes to paper 3, I must say there are certain topics which are having some sort of interlinkages, and that's why it is helping you even in paper 3 also. Similarly, when it comes to paper 4, in paper 4, though there is, again, I won't say there is a direct linkage, right? But again, you are supposed to read about the various thinkers, and those thinkers you ultimately study even in history also. So indirectly it is going to help you in paper 4 also. So the point is that whether it is true that other optional papers are helping you in GS, on the other hand, history is history is not helping at all in GS. Now that would be, I think, unfair to say, because the way the other papers are helping in general studies, in the same way I believe that history is also helping you there. But there is one area that we cannot exclude, that's about the essay paper. Now in essay paper, I'll say that there are direct linkages with history. First of all, there are certain topics that are always asked from the historical, or asked on the historical themes. There are certain questions directly they have been asked on the historical theme. And if any question which has been asked directly on the historical themes, again I am not saying that the other optional paper is not having any sort of reflection on the paper, correct? They are having, but then of course one one topic we always expect from the historical topic, that's number one. And then I can talk about specifically the various anecdotes, right? The various anecdotes that you find while reading the history, correct? Now these anecdotes were quite helpful while writing the essay, and in fact you try to think in this way. While writing an essay, you have been quoting certain examples or certain stories which are not precisely related to, I must say, let's say the practical world. Let's say they are fictional stories that they have been you have been incorporating in an essay. And then case number 2, when you have been incorporating certain anecdotes which are somehow from any historical events. Now I hope you can understand which one seems to be which one seems to be more applicable. And in fact, if you read the history thoroughly, in that case I must say you are having so many such anecdotes. Okay? You can start it from the ancient times, from let's say Kautilya, to from Buddha, let's say to Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekanand. It's full of that. And in fact, from the world history also, you do find several such examples that can somehow enhance the quality of your essays That's the beauty of it. So whether history is helping you in GS or not, I think that answer is very simple. Yes, undoubtedly it is helping you, and there are certain areas where it is directly helping you. On the other hand, there are certain areas which are like, you are not getting a direct help, but then indirect help. How indirect help? Look, ultimately, whenever you start any answer, right, any answer, so the historical context is something which is helping you. Historical context is something which is helping you, right, ultimately in framing that answer. You just imagine yourself, okay, let's say you have been writing any answer in polity, so you have to start it with the historical context. You have been writing any answer in essay paper, or let's say, sorry, in ethics paper, again the historical context can help you. Even in science and tech, some sort of historical context can help you. And in fact, like, whatsoever developments are there in the post-independence era that you even study in history, I'm not saying the same thing you are supposed to write over there, but then undoubtedly you are getting that background which is helping you to frame precisely the introduction, and maybe making that connection with the future period, ki how come, like, that historical sort of thing is transforming or transcending, right, into a new form. That's how you can get a very good comparison, and that's probably, which is like, that is probably one of the basic requirement of the all GS paper. And that's how I can say, when it comes to, like, the overlapping between history and GS, that's undoubtedly, like, quite useful for you, right? So that's how history is undoubtedly helping. So don't be under this misnomer or misconception that this is one paper which is helping you only in paper one. It is very much helping. Now here I would like to tell you one more thing, probably I did discuss earlier also, that when you apply the ideas of other optional paper into general studies, at that point of time you need to change the whole approach towards it, because somewhere you have been reading it with a very philosophical perspective, with a very theoretical perspective that cannot be applied as it is in GS paper. Rather, what you are supposed to do, rather you have to manipulate it as per your GS requirement, and that's how you need to produce it. But then it is not the case in history. Whatsoever you have studied in the optional, it can be produced in the same way in your, like, GS paper also. You don't need much manipulation, correct? So this is how, just be very clear that whatsoever content that you have read in history optional, that can be produced in multiple places, that too directly, correct? And it can help you literally in framing everything, or let's say giving structure to your answer, giving, let's say, base, a sort of, like, beauty to your answer. So that's how it's quite helpful, correct? So this is one part, like, that's how you should think of, right? Now it's coming to a very important part, and that part is about, like, what content we ultimately read in the history optional. Because one part, that is about the basic criteria, and then of course it comes to another important question. It's about the content, what you read in the optional paper, correct? Now before I come to the content, let me give you another insight into it, right? And what is that? Let's say when you study history, correct, in the general studies part, because as you all know that it is very important, and it is important in all the areas matlab, it is important in the pre-examination. And in the pre-examination, roughly I can say, or on an average I can say, that the 20 questions are being asked, that becomes 40 marks. So I'm not saying if you have read history optional, in that case you can, you are going to correct all the 20 questions, right? Of course not. And then when it comes to means, like, part, in the means, like, roughly around 90 marks. So this is the distribution of history directly in the pre and means. Now the point is this, the kind of question being asked both in the pre and means, practically speaking, it is very tough for anybody to clear, or let's say to solve these questions. Because day by day, or let's say year by year, right, they have been enhancing the quality of these questions, and their expectations are somehow going beyond a limit. And when their expectations are going, like, beyond a limit, it means that you have to prepare now that part of history carefully and in a better way, that you can address, or you can somehow, cater the requirements in the GS paper, correct? Now in order to cater the requirements, like, in the pre and the means examination, ultimately what you are supposed to do, look, try to understand, like, right now you guys have to read the ancient India, correct? Now without reading this ancient India, you can't go for this exam. And I have come across many such students, they have been avoiding ancient India by saying this, there is no great utility of this. I don't believe so. Why? because nowadays ancient probably has become more important as compared to the other paths. Now there is another area which was always being ignored by the aspirants, and that is the medieval India. And still I believe that there were so many there were so many students, they still ask this question कि whether they should go for this medieval or not. उनको लगता है कि medieval नहीं भी पढ़ेंगे काम चल जाएगा, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि अगर 2 या 3 क्वेश्चंस medieval से प्री में आ रहे हैं, ठीक है, या फिर जिस तरीके से उन लोगों ने मेंस में भी medieval से क्वेश्चंस पूछने शुरू किए हैं, उसके बाद मुझे लगता है कि अवॉइड करने के चांसेस बहुत कम है. सो आपको एक बार तो देखना पड़ेगा. Let's say you have been going for a very basic content of medieval, fair enough, but then ultimately you have to go through the medieval India. Okay, then it comes to the modern India. Correct, modern India. Now as this is a traditional sort of thing, that modern India is the most important component of the general studies syllabus, and this you need to read extensively. Extensively, by that what do I mean? That you always you are expected to read a proper book, and then while covering the syllabus of the GS also, if you are finishing ancient in 10 classes, medieval in 10 classes, the modern classes are going 30, 40, and somewhere the 50 plus classes are taken on modern. Why? Because it's considered to be very important. Though in the recent years the patterns have changed, and in fact you'll find that if there were 5 questions asked from ancient, let's say 3 questions asked from medieval, in that case only 6-7 questions are being asked from modern. But then there is a trend, right? So that's how you have been reading modern India. Then the another part that you read, that's basically the post independence. Correct? Now day by day it is also becoming one important part. And post-independence is such an area which is having overlapping with geography, with polity, with economy, with society, right? All the areas ultimately it is overlapping with that. So post-independence, that also you are supposed to read. And then it comes to the one more part, that is world history. Now again it is keeping you in a very dicey situation. Now once the old world history was introduced, they have asked questions. मतलब they were कहते हैं ना पूरे जोश में थे, उन्होंने 3-4 questions पूछे world history से. Gradually they realized probably the the kind of extra burden which is there on the students, and that's how the number went down gradually. So there are certain such years also, not a single question directly asked on world history, and that becomes 0 also. But then again you will find that the questions are being asked. Now the point is that whether they are asking the questions or not, ultimately you are supposed to read this part. You can't skip it, right? And then finally I'll say one thing, that's known as art and culture. And in fact gradually the significance of this art and culture is increasing in the UPSC examination. So either it is pre, either it is means, ultimately you have to read it. And the way they have been making their topics diverse, I think it's very tough to say that whether from where exactly they are going to ask this question. When they are asking the questions why so many important wars were fought in Panipat, that is clearly indicating to you that they can go to any range, and that's why you have to prepare, because you can't leave the question. That is not possible, because if you have been leaving one question in each paper, it means that you have lost your opportunity or the chance. So that's why I can say it is practically not possible that you have been leaving it. So it means when it comes to covering history, general studies, you have to read all these parts. ठीक है, आप कोई ऐसा पार्ट है जो आप ऐसा नहीं है कि नहीं पढ़ते, आपको हर वो पार्ट पढ़ना पड़ेगा. करेक्ट. So I think you can't skip this part. And if anybody is believing that by leaving any of the portion I can clear this UPSC, in that case probably he or she is very confident and nothing can be done, right? But then I hope you can understand that now you can't skip it. Everywhere it is being covered, and sometimes even I also feel that it is not good, but then I can't do anything. I'm helpless. That just for the sake of these many marks, in terms of the kind of coverage that you have been doing here, with respect to this, the marks which are there, that's pretty less. Ideally speaking, just by reading all those things, if you are getting, let's say 20 marks in pre-examination and 90 marks in the mains examination, so it is not a justification. But this is how UPSC has been doing. So I think we are not left with choices, and that's why we have to study it. The point is that when it comes to the coverage of all these parts, so what you are supposed to do in the history optional? What you are supposed to do in history optional? Nothing else. You have to read the same thing. Correct. Now let us try to have the overlapping with the history optional syllabus, correct? So when it comes to the history optional syllabus, so as you all know that there is there is one paper that's called as paper 1. So let's start one by one. That's paper 1. Now in paper 1 there are two parts, and what are these two parts? One which is like the part A, and this is part B. In part A you study ancient India, correct? In part B you study medieval India. Now these are two parts you have been covering. As just now I told you, that in general studies you have to study the ancient and the medieval both. For so much, for a long period people had been avoiding the medieval. They are not reading at all the medieval, right? Even ancient was also being ignored by them. So the syllabus was somehow bit small, like they were reading art and culture and modern Indian history. That's how the syllabus was being covered. But then, as I did tell you, that there are so many questions are being asked from the ancient, and in fact if you still believe that the questions being asked from ancient are nothing but the questions of art and culture, then you are in a misconception, correct? Why am I saying so? Because look, when we cover art and culture, so there are in the defined boundaries of art and culture, there are only certain topics are falling. Let's say when you have been reading art and culture and then the question is coming on architecture, fair enough. Painting, fair enough. Language and literature, fair enough. But when they have been asking questions on the terminologies, करेक्ट, और वो भी कैसे टर्मिनोलॉजीज पे क्वेश्चन पूछ रहे हैं, एंसेंट के टर्मिनोलॉजीज, एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के टर्मिनोलॉजीज, राइट, उस तरीके के क्वेश्चन पूछ रहे हैं, इक्ता सिस्टम पे क्वेश्चन पूछ रहे हैं, दैट्स अबाउट द लाइक एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव सिस्टम ऑफ द मिडिवल पीरियड. सो द वे दे आर गेटिंग इनटू एनी ऑफ द डायमेंशंस, now that cannot be fit into the category of art and culture, undoubtedly, because unfortunately by any chance we do not study them in art and culture, and that's why you can't like somehow console yourself कि नहीं ये तो आर्ट एंड कल्चर में कवर हो जाएगा. कैसे कवर हो जाएगा जब हम वो पढ़ते ही नहीं है? तो आर्ट एंड कल्चर की कैटेगरी में मत रखिए. मुझे तो आजकल ऐसा लगता है कि एंशिएंट और मिडिवल से ज़्यादा क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं और प्री में आर्ट एंड कल्चर को लोग थोड़ा अवॉइड कर रहे हैं, मेंस में डायरेक्टली कुछ क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं. ठीक है, सो व्हाट यू नीड टू keep in mind that ultimately you have to study the ancient and medieval. So in that case, am I trying to portray this fact that ultimately you are reading the ancient and medieval in for general studies, and the same thing you have been reading in same thing you have been reading in in the optional paper? Not really, right? I am not I'm not proposing that idea at all. So basically what I am trying to say that you have been covering the basics of the optional here only, correct? So everything is ultimately everything is there. What you study here, that makes you familiar with the topics what you have been reading in the what you have been reading in basically the history optional. So in ancient, what do you read? Let's say if you have been starting the syllabus, so the first topic is sources, correct? और सोर्सेज में से बहुत क्वेश्चंस ऐसे हैं जो ऑप्शनल में भी पूछते हैं, और सोर्सेज में ऐसे बहुत सारे क्वेश्चंस हैं जो ये लोग जनरल स्टडीज़ में भी पूछते हैं. दे हैव आस्क्ड अबाउट द चाइनीज सोर्सेज, दे हैव आस्क्ड अबाउट द ग्रीक सोर्सेज, करेक्ट? सो यू कैन फाइंड दैट क्वेश्चंस आर डायरेक्टली कमिंग from that part also. So you can't say ki this part should not be covered. So after the sources, let's say there's another topic, prehistory. Now normally you do not study the prehistory. Why? Because you do not expect much questions from the prehistory. बहुत लोग छोड़ देते हैं उसको, लेकिन हम पूरी तरीके से नहीं छोड़ सकते क्योंकि एक उसका aspect है prehistory का, which is very important, such as when it comes to Mesolithic paintings, and most importantly when it comes to the Neolithic transition. And when you come to the optional, ultimately the same thing is being studied. And then here onwards the kind of history starts. That history to ultimately you read in this part also. Let's say when it comes to IVC, now you study about the origin of IVC, the characteristics of IVC, then you also study about the decline of IVC, and the same topics are being supposed to be covered even in the optional paper. Yes, undoubtedly the approach is slightly different. Not I'll say approach, rather I'll prefer to say that somehow the intensity of the information is different. So you read about everything. So you read about the IVC or the Harappan period, you read about the Vedic period, you read about, let's say, Mahajanpada period, then the Mauryan period, then the post-Mauryan period, at Gupta period and the post-Gupta period. That's roughly the syllabus of ancient. You can include the early medieval here as well. You have been covering everything in this part. And now while covering the same topics in the optional, what do? Now you take it to somehow a different label, such as now when it comes to the origin of IBC. Now let's say if we have been precisely talking about the origin of IBC. Now what we study in the origin of IBC, ki, okay, there might be two ways of defining the origin of IBC, correct? So you know about the migration theory, you know about the indigenous theory. What you do in the optional, you associate it with some of the what? Some of the scholars. Now instead of reading it directly, what you say, ki, okay, who are the scholars? They have been giving this migrationist theory and who are giving this indigenous theory, and what are the grounds of it? That's it. When it comes to, let's say, decline of Harappan civilization, the same thing has been done. So what you do, you just add certain more specifications, right? And that's how you understand it, correct? At the same time, I would like to give you some other examples also from this part, because when it comes to when it comes to the first part, that is ancient India, precisely I have been dealing with the ancient India. So let's say there are certain topics and they are so important that ultimately they are not only important but they are very interesting also, because nowadays what is happening, the political history is not very important. So the kind of perception that we are having, that we have to ultimately mug up so many things, right? The name of this, the name of the rulers, their regnal period and the various wars they had been fighting. But then frankly speaking, these are the things which are not very important. I think the kind of shift that you find, both here in general studies and even in the optional paper, what are these areas where you can find the major shift? So it is shifting to somehow social history. It is shifting to somehow economic history. And most importantly these days, it is shifting to the history of art and culture, correct? Now in last few years, I have noticed that the art and culture have become a very significant area, both in general studies and even in optional papers. Earlier, in whole paper of whole paper 1, let's say max to max one question was being asked from the art and culture. Nowadays, we find there were multiple questions being asked from the art and culture, and that's how it remains important. So now these are the areas which have somehow become important. Now this is, I guess, the most interesting part. And here you don't need to mug up the things, rather you need to basically conceptualize the thing. Let's understand it with the help of certain example. Let's say when it comes to society. Now you know about the, let's say, Varna, or you can take another example is caste. Now when it comes to the caste, correct? So you have to understand the caste as a topic in general studies, right? In history, in the social issues, right? Caste is even helping you in paper 2, right? And even paper 4 also, correct? So now this is that understanding of caste is helping you in multiple ways. Now maybe when it comes to history, we have been understanding the caste in a very different way. How? We are trying to understand the origin of the caste system. So that origin of the caste system you have been reading even in the general studies paper. So either you are reading it in history or else you are reading it in society, but somewhere you have been reading. That's the most important thing. Padhna to aapko padega. You can't skip this, right? It is important. But then the same caste is being studied in history also, correct? So when you take the society, correct? So we understand that society or the various transformations in the happening in the society, and most importantly when it comes to the evolution of various things in the society, so that you understand through this, right? So that's how it is. When it comes to economy, now most of you are aware of the coming of European companies and the way they started having trade with India. Fair enough, right? But at the same time you should also keep in mind that there is a historical context, and in fact under this historical context we can understand in a better way the way gradually India's trade and commerce, or let's say the economy was booming, और इकोनॉमी वाज गेटिंग मोर एंड मोर प्रॉस्परस. सो किस पीरियड में किस तरीके से डेवलपमेंट हो रही है, एंड आई बिलीव दैट इट इज़ अ वेरी फैसिनेटिंग पार्ट ऑफ इंडियन हिस्ट्री. Why? Because the way you see कि किस तरीके से earlier it was the Silk Route and then the northwestern part of India which is somehow connected to this trade, and then how come it was boosting the economy of India, that somehow facilitates the second urbanization. Then you see the gradual shift of that to the western coast of India, and then naturally it comes to it comes that question that If there was a shift, why was this shift? Like, so I think it's a very natural question. And in fact, like, whenever these kind of questions are there, you need to address those questions. So I think what is history, you have been like, somehow coming up with some sort of general questions. So if you have been reading history, probably in general studies, and then certain questions are coming into your mind. So when you try to answer these questions, like, that becomes optional, right? And what you need to do specifically with that option, you have to just associate some, like, name of historians, some scholars, those whose studies are precisely on those topics, and that is what you are supposed to write. And in fact, like, I must say, this trend has become more important these days in history optional, and that's how you need to cover it. So in the same way, economy, so it is like, something that you need to understand in form of a transition, how gradually it's getting transformed. So that's the most important thing. Art and culture, correct? Now again, it's a very interesting part. Art and culture is not something like constructing a temple or constructing a mosque. If you believe that somebody is coming and constructing a mosque, I think that would be very unfair to see it. Maybe when you read it in general studies, you read it in this way, okay, this is the Nagara, like in a form of architecture, these are some specific features. But the moment you connect it with the various other dimensions, such as when you connect it, let's say, with polity, when like Guptas are coming, and how come the Guptas have been going for this Nagara form of architecture, then like what happened to this form of architecture when it is being patronized by the other rulers of the kingdoms. So that you understand, when you try to understand the development of various forms of architecture with respect to the various changes which were happening, like other changes that may include the social changes, that may include the economic changes, and how come they are interrelated. And in fact, this is what you have seen in this this year's question paper also. That question is asking about the Buddhist institutions, and then the artisan guilds, and then traders and the state, that how come they were related. So try to get my point, this kind of interrelationship, which is literally interesting when you try to analyze the things, when you try to open up the things, and you understand how the, it has been facilitating further changes. So I think this is what you need to understand art and culture. In art and culture में ऐसे अगर पढ़ने के लिए आप बोले तो ऐसा नहीं कि ठीक है भाई उसने नगरा फॉर्म ऑफ आर्किटेक्चर है तो कर्वीलिनियर वो है शिखरस है, उसके ऊपर जो है अम्लक है, उसके ऊपर जो है एक फ्लैग है, और ये उसके जो है प्रदक्षिणा पथ है. आई थिंक दिस इज नॉट ओनली विच इज सपोज टू बी सपोज टू बी हिस्ट्री, दैट यू रीड इन जनरल स्टडीज पार्ट, उसको थोड़ा स्पेसिफाई करते हैं, दैट बिकम्स द ऑप्शनल. सो व्हेन इट कम्स टू द एंशिएंट इंडिया, whatsoever you see, that you see precisely with this particular perspective. And some you'll find exactly the same even in the medieval period also. Medieval period is also not very different. When it comes to medieval period, exactly what are the main themes of the medieval period? So when it comes to, let's say, Sultanate period, right, and then the period between the Sultanate and Mughal, which is precisely known for the Vijayanagar and Bahmani kingdom, and to a certain extent we can talk about Ahom kingdom also, and then finally it comes to Mughal kingdom, right? So there were three kingdoms that we precisely study here. But then how many questions you find from that, from that core political history of this period? There are very less questions, right? Minor questions are being asked. Most of the questions, again I'll say that they were coming from this particular dimension only. And what you ultimately study in which part? That you study in the general studies part. When it comes to, let's say, society. Now categorically in your syllabus it is specified the society during this particular period. In fact, there were two topics where they have given the society and culture, two different topics, one for Sultanate. In fact, I'll say that three topics. One is for Sultanate, one for this Vijayanagar and Bahmani, and one for this Mughal period. In the same way, the economy for this for this period, and then at the end it comes to the development of art and culture. So these are the things what you specify in that part, and you study even in the medieval part also. So this is how we can say when it comes to paper 1. Now you can't find great differences between the two. You just need to add some add some new let's say new features, or let's say new facts, and some sort of analysis, and that analysis is somehow making it more important. And why am I telling you about importance and then the fascination, basically because the subject what you enjoy while reading, so I think that you need to it becomes easier for you to grasp it. one subject that you have been reading without any interest, and then you are trying to do it or trying to cover the syllabus of it, and one subject that you take certain interest and then you read it. Okay, so that's how I think the picture is very clear. So when you are having certain interest, in that case you start enjoying it. And what I always used to say, कि ultimately what you study in history, you study this in history, that how come the things are changing, correct? And when it comes to understanding the various changes, undoubtedly it's quite quite interesting. It's quite fascinating. Now, while understanding those changes, right, what you need to do at the same time, in order to convey it properly, you need to have certain facts and all, correct? Because without facts, nothing can be conveyed properly. So any paper, any optional paper, or even in general studies for that matter, if you talk about, ultimately you need certain facts to convey your ideas. To that extent, the facts are even needed in this part also, in history optional also, in order to convey your idea, correct? So basically everything what you study in general studies, in ancient and medieval, the same things are being studied. Exactly the same thing is being studied. As I told you, that what do you add here, facts are being studied here only. What you add further, you further add the analysis, and in that analysis you include certain names of historians. As simple as that, right? So it is not it is not making the things complicated. It is a simple part. Whether you take history as an optional paper or not hardly matters. Ultimately this too you have to do. There is no solution of it. Then it comes to paper 2. When it comes to paper 2, as usual in paper 2 also there are two parts, right? So there is one part, that is again part A, and this part A covers modern India, correct? And this is part B, that is the modern world. Now this is part A and part B. Now what do you study in modern India? Now you study the various topics in modern India. That starts from the colonization, correct? So that starts from the coming of various European companies, correct? And then the condition of India at that point of time, the colonization of India, and that colonization is further taken into the various sort of sufferings of Indians. Or let's say in a different way, you can understand the various negative impacts of this colonization that you understand, and then ultimately what do you see? The various responses to this colonization. That's the modern India, correct? Again I'll be repeating that you see first colonization of India, then you see the various negative impacts of the colonization of India, then you further see the various responses to this colonization of India, and that is what called as modern India, partially, right? Partially matlab majority of the modern India is this only, correct? So first of all, there's nothing as such which is not known to you. You know, इतना तो आप सबको पता होगा कि इंडिया जो है एक कॉलोनी था, ठीक है? And India was an ideal colony. And India has been colonized since, let's say, 1757. That is a bit subjective. From middle of 18th century to, let's say, middle of 20th century, India remained colonized, roughly speaking, for those 200 years. And in fact, they did great amount of exploitation of India. And then finally we fought a battle that's called as India's War of Independence, and then India becomes independent. And then when I say कि आपको महात्मा गांधी के बारे में पता है या नहीं, आपको कांग्रेस के बारे में पता है या नहीं, आपको भगत सिंह के बारे में पता है या नहीं, आपको जो है अंबेडकर के बारे में नहीं पता है, बोस के बारे में नहीं पता है, there is nothing as such that you are not familiar with. That's point number 1. The point number 2, when it comes to modern India, undoubtedly in modern India you also study basically in modern India you also study in general studies. And as I did tell you that when you read it in general studies, there it is the expectation from you to become more and more familiar with this part. So whether the questions are coming or not, it is expected from you to know more about it. मतलब आप ज़्यादा जाने उसके बारे में, आप ज़्यादा एक्सटेंसिवली पढ़े उसके बारे में, ठीक है. क्वेश्चंस भी खासकर प्री में जो आते हैं वो कई बार बड़े फैक्चुअल से क्वेश्चंस होते हैं. सो आपसे एक्सपेक्टेशन ज़्यादा है. अगर मैं बहुत जनरल शब्दों में बात करूं तो आपको स्पेक्ट्रम पढ़ने के लिए कही जाती है, विच इज़ अ वेरी थिक बुक फुल ऑफ फैक्ट्स, एंड बट यू हैव बीन रीडिंग दैट बुक, करेक्ट, एंड यू हैव बीन मगिंग एवरीथिंग. So this is one part which is covered by you extensively, right? आप बहुत अच्छे से cover कर लेते हैं, and I believe that in fact paper 1, while having the discussion on paper 1, I did tell you that at least in paper 1 what you did, that you have been, I told you that you have studied it in a very narrow way, and then you have been adding so many facts and then analysis and then some interpretations also in paper 1. In paper 2 I must say that you have been reading everything. मतलब यहाँ पे आपको कोई बहुत value addition करने की जरूरत नहीं है. The only thing that you have to understand, understand here is about the certain interpretations by the scholars, right? So you know everything. You know everything. You have to just need to add the interpretation in this part. That's what you do in the modern India. In modern India, there are certain paths, certain paths, and in fact, this part is, part is very important. And as one of the part of it, as I have already discussed, is the post-independence. Correct. Now, post-independence, right? Post-independence is so significant. So first, you have been covering so many topics here, such as there is one theme which is talking about the consolidation of India as a nation. And in this part, you read the foreign policy, you read basically India's relationship with the neighbors, the linguistic reorganization of the state, you read about the regionalization or the regionalism, you read about the integration of the princely states, and then electoral politics, everything you read just in 1 unit. So more or less, I believe that most of the thing what you study in GS, or else I can say ki what makes the base of your GS that you study in this particular part. Apart from this also, you read about the caste and ethnicity, right? So again, when you read caste, that is something that can be connected to the ancient part, that can help you in a better way, correct? That is somehow helping you in such a way that you are somehow getting every idea very clear about the caste. When you deal with the same topic, let's say caste is coming, and that's why I'm giving you this example. When it comes to, let's say, caste, now if you do not have that formal understanding of the caste, right, unfortunately you won't be able to understand or comprehend it ever. जब आप कास्ट को हिस्ट्री में पढ़ते हैं, you understand it with basically the various understanding of the scholars. So you read it with the perspective of Nicholas B. Dirks, ठीक है, caste of mind, ठीक है. So this is one book which is somehow forming, or let's say constituting the base of the understanding of caste, right? अब यही कास्ट की अंडरस्टैंडिंग अगर आपने एंशिएंट में डेवलप की है, सो व्हेन इट कम्स टू द मॉडर्न टाइम्स और पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस पीरियड, नाउ आई थिंक इट्स क्वाइट हेल्पफुल. आपको बहुत अच्छे से समझ में आएगा कि उस कास्ट के साथ आपको कैसे ट्रीट करना है. व्हेन इट दिस कास्ट इज बीइंग कनेक्टेड टू द अदर थिंग्स, undoubtedly you'll be able to deal with in a better way. Let's say there is a very important part here in the post independence segment, that is about the Dalit movements. Now when it comes to Dalit movement, I think nobody can understand the Dalit movement without having a fair understanding of the resistance of the suppressed or the oppressed caste since the ancient times. So when you know about, let's say, Buddhism, when you know about Jainism, when you know about Bhakti movement, when you know about many such movements which were there in the ancient times, right? And at the same time, when you know about Ambedkar, then Jyotiba Phule, Ambedkar, MC Raja, and so on, Namudri Path. So I think that is the understanding which is somehow made by, made by ultimately, that historical understanding. So that's how we can say, that's something what you have already learned, and once you need to connect it with the various other things, without having that idea of history, you won't be able to connect it. In a similar fashion, there is another topic that's called as economic development and the political changes. Now here you read about most of the economic changes in India. So either it is about the land reform, or it is about the ecology and the environmental development, which is again connected to science and tech and all. Okay? So that's how you read about all these things in this part, and I believe that this is one section of your history which is helping you more or less in every part of the syllabus, right? Either you attempt the questions in general studies, or else you attempt the questions in, like, let's say, in the essay paper, it is helping you, correct? So this is one idea which is quite helpful, right? And then it comes to modern India, right? Modern world, right? Now when it comes to the modern world, what exactly you read in modern world? That's again, it's very important. So modern world, as from the name itself, is very clear that you first start your syllabus with the beginning of this modern world. So the way Indian history is being divided into ancient, medieval and modern, you are not reading that ancient and the medieval part, rather you have been reading only the modern part, correct? And in this modern part, you start, like, start the syllabus with this coming of, like, the modernity in the West, and that modernity you basically study with the Enlightenment and the modern ideas. And the moment you understand the Enlightenment and modern ideas, and under this, like, you ultimately read about the various philosophers like Kant is there, Rousseau is there, Marx is there, okay, and then all these ideas are there. And then further it is connected to most of the other important changes, such as the next topic is the origin of modern politics. Now when it comes to modern politics, what exactly it is the application of, like, the first topic that you have studied, and this application we mostly find in form of multiple revolutions. Revolutions as in, such as, like, when it comes to American Revolution, the Civil War, the French Revolution, right, the British democratic politics, or let's say some British revolutions. So all these revolutions you read over there. Along with this, like, there's another revolution that you read in the next unit, that is about basically industrial revolution, right? So industrial revolution precisely in Britain, and industrialization of some other countries, and then it takes to the further thing. Again, the next application of this was the rise of nation state. So when you read nation state, so when you will club everything, when you will club the coming of modern ideas, when you club all these revolutions, when you see the origin of modern politics and then industrialization, it creates such kind of environment which brings that idea of basically what imperialism and the colonialism. And when you study the imperialism and colonialism, that is further taken to what? Like, undoubtedly, like, it is further taken to basically the decolonization. So everything is there in a chain, and then it is getting connected with the World War, First World War, then interwar period, then the Second World War, and then finally it comes to basically the, like, decolonization, as I have already discussed, and then finally you see the Cold War after the Second World War, then the Russian disintegration, and the syllabus is getting over, correct? So now everything what you study here, I think they are pretty interesting. And as I have already told you, that when you understand the India in the current scenario, when you try to understand the foreign relations, or that's also called as international relation, that cannot be understood without the help of history. So it is not only helping you in multiple areas, it is even somehow, it is the most interesting part of history. As I was telling you, that if you study world history in a careful manner, in that case you'll find that there are several aspects of, there were several stories are there in world history, and they are so important, right? Ki on whatsoever topic you find certain examples, in whatsoever topic, you find certain anecdotes, world history is providing you. आप कहीं पे भी देख लीजिए, आप चाहे एथिक्स के आंसर लिख रहे हो, आप चाहे ऐसे के आंसर्स लिख रहे हो, आप कोई भी आंसर्स लिख रहे हो, किसी भी जगह पे आप आंसर्स लिख रहे हैं, आपको ये हेल्प करेगी, और अनडाउटेडली बहुत बेहतर तरीके से हेल्प करेगी. सो दैट्स हाउ वर्ल्ड हिस्ट्री इज ऑल्सो वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग. सो आई थिंक दिस इज द हिस्ट्री ऑफ, दिस इज द कंटेंट दैट यू स्टडी. And I don't believe that this content, covering this content is a magic, or you need some sort of extra skill to do it. Actually not. Anybody can cover it. Okay? Anybody can cover it. The point is that, he or she should have some basic interest in the subject, right? हिस्ट्री आपको थोड़ा फैसिनेट करती हो, थोड़ा आपको लगता है कि ये थोड़ा आपको जो है चीज़ों को इंटरेस्टिंग बना रही है, तो उस केस में मुझे लगता है कि देयर इज़ नो प्रॉब्लम इन टेकिंग हिस्ट्री एज एन ऑप्शनल पेपर, बिकॉज इट इज़ अनडाउटेडली क्वाइट हेल्पफुल. And as I did tell you that when it comes to the that rumor that it is not getting you marks, I think again it is incorrect. It is always getting you the marks, right? If somebody can cross 300, why can't you cross 300, right? Of course you can cross 300. So that is something which is not which is a sort of magical figure. It's very much achievable figure. You can also cross 300 provided you have the right approach toward the subject. Sometimes, like, people used to say, कि, "Arey, last year I got, like, gave this exam, I got 220. It means that UPSC is expecting more facts from me. And that's why I should collect more facts and I should try to provide it. I think that would be completely unfair to say, right? That is not correct. Just by adding more facts, you can't get the marks. It is all about the analysis. And if I'll say you in simple terms that what is history? So history is simply the changes and the continuity which is there in the society, and we have to understand them. And we have to understand them with respect to certain, like, scholars, that how they have been analyzing those changes and the, like, those changes and all. That's all about this history. That's how we, like, need to cover. So probably it is all about the mindset, that it is, like, it is not getting you the desired result as such. Your approach is having problem, like, problems, and that's why you can't do it. I think it's very simple. It's like the story, okay? It's like the story, but then the story should be understood with a sort of academic perspective rather than, like, a very general perspective. मतलब आप लेमैन की तरह, चाय दुकान की तरह बात नहीं कर सकते कि हाँ भाई इसने उसको मारा, इसने बहुत मारा, उसको मजा आ गया. हाँ, वो अप्रोच तो नहीं चाहिए होगा, ठीक है? अप्रोच मतलब थोड़ा academic approach, ठीक है? If that change is there, like, why was this change, ठीक है? And that's how, if you have been reading history, I think it doesn't remain very tough as such. So if you see history as, like, as an optional paper, that's the general perception of this, correct? So this was the second part of this lecture. Now I'll be moving to the third part of this lecture. And what is this third part of the lecture? So as I did tell you that precisely it is like trying to discuss about that how to cover this ancient India. Ancient India. Now this is the third part. What I would like to discuss. Now when it comes to ancient India, again I'll say that majorly the things we have discussed, but then the way, like, what we are supposed to cover, what are the topics, like, that we have to study, and so on, right? Now I would like to discuss something in a more intense way about this ancient India and how you should treat this ancient India. That's the most important thing, correct? So first of all, in ancient India, roughly if I'll be telling you, so what we are studying, so we start our syllabus from what? From, the one topic is basically the sources, correct? And why the sources are very important? Because in history, sources do play very important role. Anything which is written without referring the sources, that is precisely falling in the category of what? Fiction. So as I told you that when you are getting, when you are participating in a debate, in a tea stall और एक चाय की दुकान पे या चाय की टपरी पे जब पार्टिसिपेट करते हैं, सो नोबडी इज कंट्रोलिंग यू. आप जो भी कहना चाहते हैं आप कहिए, ठीक है? आपके ऊपर कोई कंट्रोल नहीं कि आप सही कह रहे हैं, गलत कह रहे हैं, ठीक है? दैट इज लाइक फिक्स इट. व्हेन संजय लीला भंसाली इज मेकिंग पद्मावत और लेट्स से व्हाट्सओवर इट इज पद्मावती और पद्मावत, आप वो उनके पास पूरी फ्रीडम है, ठीक है, कि आप वो जो दिखाना चाहते हैं वो दिखा रहे हैं. हालांकि आजकल जनता इतनी कॉन्शियस है कि कुछ गलत दिखाया तो लोगों ने जो है उस पर उन पर जो है वो किया, क्रिटिसिज्म किया, क्रिटिसाइज़ किया कि आप ऐसा नहीं दिखा सकते. अब तो ये एक तरीके की इनलाइटनमेंट है जो इंडिया में आ रही है. अब पहले तो लोग इंटरटेन सिर्फ इन्जॉय करते थे, अगर उनको इन्जॉयमेंट मिली दे आर हैप्पी विद दैट, राइट? दे नेवर क्वेश्चन कि आप सही दिखा रहे हैं या गलत दिखा रहे हैं. ओके, फाइन. So the point is that this is a very important topic. Then further, that history start with prehistory, correct? And it goes up to let's say early medieval period. Early medieval period. Now there would be two ways to see this history, correct? There would be two ways of seeing this history. Now, what are these two ways? There is one way that you read just the chronological history. And what is chronological history? Simply you read, let's say you take, you pick IBC as one topic, followed by Vedic, followed by Mahajanpada, followed by Mauryan, followed by post-Mauryan, and then further the Gupta period, further post-Gupta period, and even further I can say the early medieval India. Correct? You have divided the syllabus in this way. And then you have just made the division and you become very specific. When it comes to IVC, okay, there are 1 topic, 2 topic and 3 topic. You have studied IVC, the IVC is finished. Whenever you have been referring any notes, correct? Precisely I am telling you notes. Why? Because yes, this problem is majorly there in the notes. Now notes are talking about in a particular dimension. So let's say when it comes to IVC, they talk about the origin, they talk about origin, they talk about, let's say, the features of IVC, they talk about decline, that's it, IVC is over. Correct? When it comes to Vedic period, again, you study, let's say, the political aspect, you study the economic aspect, you study the social and the religious aspects is done. When it comes to Mahajanpada period, okay, there were 2-3 changes that you study in the Mahajanpada period. So what you are doing, you are confining the syllabus, right? I think probably this is not the same thing which is expected from you when you cover the ancient India. Precisely I have been discussing here the ancient India, and in the similar fashion we'll go for the medieval and the modern also. Whenever we'll be starting the syllabus with that part, we'll be talking about that. Right now, since we are starting with the ancient India, and that's why I have been discussing about that. So there is one way of covering, this is simply this, that you cover the history chronologically and that's how you finish it. And frankly speaking, this is how majorly history is being covered. Now there is some certain limitations. I'm not blaming anybody. There are certain limitations ki the history has been written down with this particular perspective, and that's how we have been reading it with that perspective, right? But then there will be another way, TK, and another way, and what is that? I can say ki this is the cross parallel, right? Cross parallel history. Now what is this cross parallel history? We do not understand it only with respect to chronology, right? But I'll say that along with the chronology, we also try to connect basically themes. So if you have been connecting these two together, in that case somehow you'll be developing a better perception of the subject, the better understanding of the subject. Let's say when as I have already discussed this point, while reading the history now, they are not focusing much on what? Political history. Rather, we have been focusing on, let's say, economy. We have been focusing a lot on society. We have been focusing a lot on, let's say, religion, right? We have been focusing a lot on the cultural aspect. Okay? So these are the dimensions which are focused upon. Now, just tell me honestly one thing. Do you literally believe that this is also changing as per the changing dynasties? Do you literally believe that once the dynasty got changed, Mauryans were being replaced by, let's say, the Sungas, the society would change as along with the changes, political change? No, it's not possible. It's practically not possible. Now, neither the society is going to change, nor the economy is going to change, nor not the culture and the religion. Minor changes would be there, but then it is not drastically changing it. So this is the reason, because I told you that chronology and the theme, they should be merged together. Chronology is precisely dealing with the political history, because there only you can apply it. Okay, Mauryans gone and the post-Mauryans are coming. Or let's say Sungas, Kanvas, Satavahanas, Kusara, Indo-Greeks like Sakas and the Kusanas are coming. It is quite applicable to that part or to that history. But it is not applicable to the history in which not only the university is interested, or let's say academicians are interested, but even the UPSC is also interested. Correct? So that's how, first thing that you have to connect it in, understand it in this way. So this is one suggestion that you have to keep in mind. I'll say that this is suggestion number 1. This is how you have to read it. Now it comes to the second suggestion. We always read history in a very scattered manner. What is the meaning of scattered manner? Look, any of my video, you just pick up from the internet, pick up from this YouTube or wherever you find. I always used to say one thing, whenever it comes to paper 1 precisely, that should be understood conceptually. And what is the concept? Everything what is happening in this world, is not precisely related to one thing. It is related to multiple things. Correct. So there is a sort of interconnection. So if any political change is there, like it must be connected with economy, it must be connected with certain changes in society, like so basically that interconnection among the topics, that's very important. Now ancient India should be understood with respect to this. When you talk about, let's understand it with respect to examples, certain examples. Let's say when you talk about the Varna system, and if you try to define the Varna system only with respect to, let's say, either society, right? First I'll write either religion. Why? Because it's a religious institution, and that's how, if you try to understand the Varna with respect to religion, that would be only a partial understanding. If we'll try to understand the Varna with respect to only society, that would be again a partial understanding of the Varna. If we'll try to understand Varna with respect to only, let's say, economy, that also would be a partial understanding. With respect to polity, that will be a partial understanding. What is the best understanding? That when you try to understand Varna with this way. That's it. So when you read history, you have to keep in mind very categorically that try to learn that how to connect one thing with another thing. And that's it. That is something which is making history interesting. That is making history as the subject, what you enjoy reading. Now, if you have been reading the Varna system in this way, in Rig Veda, 10th Mandala, Purush Sukta is there, which is giving a slok which talks about the origin of the Varna system. Fair enough. Then you also read that yes, there is a definition of the Varna that has been provided, where that has been provided, let's say, in the Rig Veda, in the Purush Sukta. Okay, this is the definition of the Varna system, and that's how Varna is coming. But then the second way, that if you try to understand the Varna with respect to basically the religious aspect, the social aspect, economic aspect, that how come through Varna, it had been tried to control so many things of society, and it was helping certain communities, it was helping certain communities to run the economy smoothly, the polity smoothly, the society smoothly, the religion smoothly. That's how the real concept of Varna comes in. So I think this is what this is what something making interesting. ये है जो हमें हमारी वो इंटरेस्ट, नेचुरल इंटरेस्ट पैदा करता है. अगर अदरवाइज हम एक्चुअली पढ़ लिया हमने कि वर्ना इस पीरियड में आया, ये 4 वर्नास थे, ऐसे ये श्लोक है जो हमने रट्टा मार लिया, ठीक है, और हमने वर्ना समझ लिया, तो आई थिंक that naturally it will become boring. So the second suggestion is that never ever understand everything in a partial way. Always try to think in a very conceptual way. Try to somehow interlink it with the other possible areas, and that's how you understand it. So ना तो ये boring होने से not only it is somehow making it less boring, right, or making it not making it boring, it is simultaneously making it more interesting, I must say, and then only you enjoy reading it. So this is the second thing that you have to keep in mind, correct? So the first suggestion, as I told you, that somehow you have to understand the chronology with the themes, right? Cross parallel connections basically should be there. Second, I told you that try to understand it with the multi-dimensional way, correct? So that I will write that it is the best way of understanding it, multi-dimensional way, right? That's the second thing. And while understanding something in a multi-dimensional way, how come the historians are becoming important? Now, I think this is how the historians are becoming important, correct? So, frankly speaking, there are several ideas what the historians are giving and what makes it multi-dimensional, and that makes it interesting also. And there only the historians have they are becoming very important, and that's how we start liking the subject. That's also one part which is important, right? So this is the second thing that you have to keep in mind. Okay, fine. The third thing. Now the third thing, since we have been covering a larger period, correct? So ancient is undoubtedly the most stretched part of our syllabus, and that's how you understand the history in a broader terms. Now, what do I mean by the broader terms? The broader terms matlab, you try to understand two aspects of this, okay? One is continuity and one is change. Now these are two broader terms, and while understanding the ancient India precisely, to a certain extent even applicable in the modern India, probably it is not that much applicable in the modern India, but then yes, in medieval India, probably I said modern India. So it is very much required in ancient, to a certain extent in medieval, less applicable in modern, but it is there. But then it remains very important, right? Very important, specifically in which part? In the ancient part. You have been covering, let's say, from IBC to 12th century. So that's roughly around 5,000 years. So while covering the 5,000 years, you cannot talk about the minor things. ठीक है, minor things as in उसने उसको थप्पड़ मार दिया, उसने उसको गाली दे दी, they are not important. You talk about the bigger structural changes. So bigger structural changes, and then undoubtedly what I have told you, that those bigger structural changes must be connected with the other things that can get you a better insight of the subject, right? So these are three important suggestions that you have to keep in mind. And if you do not include these kind of things in your let's say in your study, in that case probably you are not doing the justice with the subject, correct? So these are few things that you have to keep in mind for the subject, precisely for the ancient India. And of course, there are so many fringes of the information, which are so many informations are there on the fringes of this, on the periphery of this. We cannot discuss everything here. So in the first class itself, I'll be talking about all those things in a more organized manner, undoubtedly for the ancient one. So because we will be going for similar sessions for ancient, for medieval, for modern. So while beginning that class, I'll go for it. So that's it. Thank you very much. I believe that it must be helpful to you. Thank you.